My dear students, it is nice meeting you after such a long time. I especially mean the students of Rishi Bankim Chandra College, from whom I am separated for quite a number of months. But we meet again, although not in the classroom, but in a virtual classroom. And today I shall be giving you an introduction to Dr. Samuel Johnson's Preface to Shakespeare. Now, well, you see, Shakespeare criticism is a very important field today. And if we think of the critiques of Shakespeare, in the earliest times, we shall have to start with Shakespeare's colleague and friend, Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson was junior to Shakespeare by more than 15 years, and they were great friends. And after Shakespeare's abrupt and premature death, Ben Jonson wrote a long poem which can be taken by us as the first piece of Shakespeare criticism. And I read the first two lines. You can have the poem on the internet very easily, but today I just read the first two lines of the poem. To draw no envy, Shakespeare, on thy name am I thus ample to thy book and fame. And there Ben Jonson goes on to praise Shakespeare, comparing him with Marlowe and Keats, and coming to the conclusion that he is much greater than these two. And Ben Jonson also says that Shakespeare's genius can perhaps be compared only to the genius of the great Greek masters like Aeschylus and Sophocles. And he also says that though Shakespeare did not have much formal education, he didn't know much of Greek or Latin, but he got his training in the school of nature. Thus, as I said, we can say that Ben Jonson is perhaps the first critique of Shakespeare. And then, after Shakespeare's death in 1616, his two friends, Hemming and Condell, took up the plays of Shakespeare, and the first folio edition came in 1623, that is 7 years after the death of Shakespeare, and there they added a preface. So this preface is also a part of Shakespeare criticism, and very important, because They knew Shakespeare the man. Milton wrote a poem on Shakespeare. So we may call that poem by Milton a miniature form of Shakespeare criticism. And then came John Dryden. John Dryden, he also was a great Shakespeare critique, especially in his essay on dramatic poesy. He speaks of Shakespeare in his own way. He compares Shakespeare with Ben Jonson. So John Dryden may be considered a Shakespeare critique. Then in 1725 came Alexander Pope's edition of Shakespeare's plays. And there Alexander Pope added his preface. Although Alexander Pope was scathingly criticized, and his critics said that Alexander Pope did not have the critical acumen, nor did he have the scholarship to read and edit Shakespeare in a proper way. Still then, his effort to try to evaluate Shakespeare must not be demeaned. So Pope is also one of the early critiques of Shakespeare. And finally comes our concern today, that is the preface by Dr. Samuel Johnson. Dr. Samuel Johnson, if you remember, I talked about Dr. Samuel Johnson at length to you when I took up Johnson's poem London. A few words about Johnson I'll repeat to refresh your memory. Dr. Samuel Johnson, 1709 to 1784, did not have a very long life, but what he did was splendid. Dr. Johnson studied in the University of Oxford, but when he came out of the university, he didn't have any degree. He didn't get any degree from the university, or perhaps he didn't finish his course of study there. But the University of Oxford conferred on him an honorary doctorate degree when Dr. Johnson published his lexicon, the great lexicon. Dr. Johnson was a multifaceted man, a man of great genius. Well, although he was sort of inflexible in his attitude on many occasions, but his greatness must be acknowledged by all of us. Dr. Johnson married late in life and married a lady who was 20 years older than him. But Dr. Johnson always believed that there must be, compatibility of temperament between the husband and the wife. And when he chose his wife, he had in his mind this one criteria, perhaps. Dr. Johnson is often ridiculed by the people of the subsequent generations for his declamatory style, high sounding words. And there is a story about Dr. Johnson, which we were told by our teacher in our classroom. I do not know anything about the authenticity of this story, but very interesting story definitely. This story will highlight how he was fond of bombastic language. Now a lady one day came to him and asked him, Dr. Johnson, what is circumlocution? And as you all know, circumlocution means a roundabout way of stating things. And Dr. Johnson answered, circumlocution, madam, it is a pleonastic style of oratorical sonorosity lost in rhetorical verbosity. Now, well, this explanation or definition of Dr. Johnson is itself an example of circumlocution. Anyway, Dr. Johnson is to be remembered by us for his dictionary, for his lives of poets, great work that he did, and of course for his preface to the plays of Shakespeare, which came in 1765. And let me tell you that this class should be taken as just the introduction. I shall go into the detail, and if possible, I shall read some of the parts of Preface to Shakespeare in my next class, but I shall be just telling you or some of the more important characteristics or some of the more important features of Dr. Johnson's preface in a nutshell. Now I think most of you have this text. If you have this text, our advantage will be that I shall be referring to the page numbers. So the page numbers that I shall refer to will tally with this text only. If you have this text, you can see for yourself and can get the particular references, as I say, in the particular pages. Now what I am doing right now is giving you rather a summary of what Dr. Johnson has said about Shakespeare in his great preface. Now please look at the board, and I have written over there the points, but I have not written there the page numbers. I shall be telling you the page numbers as I briefly discuss these points. So the first point is pleasure. You can see that in page number 132. Now what do you mean by pleasure? What do we understand by pleasure? What was Shakespeare's primary aim? His primary aim in his plays was to give pleasure. No aim to give instruction to his audiences, to the people, but just give them pleasure, for which the people used to go to the theatre. The second, you can see over there, Shakespeare was a poet of nature. By poet of nature, Dr. Johnson suggested that he could look at man and human situations from a natural point of view. And therefore his characters can convince us more easily. Although many of his characters are placed in high position, the king, the general, etc. But they have their human dispositions, their human weaknesses, their human tendencies, which are similar to the same propensities, tendencies, penchants and weaknesses of all human beings. So he is a natural poet, and that you can see in page 133. But that means, well, as I said, that means that, well, Shakespeare could have a universal appeal. So, well, Hamlet, for example, you see, Prince of Denmark. But here in India, when we read Hamlet, we can look at Hamlet in our own way. Well, Hamlet appeals to us as ourselves, as if we are Hamlets. So that was the greatness in Shakespeare. He was so natural a poet, so natural an artist, that, well, he could present his characters and situations in such a way as to appeal to all the people of the entire world. Then point 3, you see, practical actions and domestic wisdom. And this is 133 again. So, well, there Dr. Johnson refers to Euripides. Euripides was different from either Aeschylus or Sophocles, and therefore Euripides was criticized by some, because, well, Euripides didn't always present very high things. Shakespeare also was like that. Well, what were the wisdoms or what were the actions which could come out of his plays? These were simply domestic, common, the common instructions which men will accept willingly. So these is to come from Shakespeare. Number 4, he could present his characters in such a way that no two characters were similar. So Macbeth and Banquo, or Edmund or Edgar, or Rosalind and Celia, although presented together in different plays, but, well, we can immediately understand their differences. So no two characters were similar. And then next point, well, this point you can see in page 134. Point 5, mirror of life. You can see that in page 135. So that was earlier in 134, and the number 5 point, mirror of life, in 135. The mirror of life, this is, well, continuation of the same point. Mirror of life, not something extraordinary, although, well, apparently the situations and the characters may be, as I said, larger than life, but what he presented was a mirror of life, meaning what we see here in our own life, what we can experience in our own life. And then, well, this is very important, 6th point. This you can see in page 136, that there is in Shakespeare a fusion of the comic and the tragic. And for that, many neoclassical scholars and critics, they have criticized Shakespeare, because the Greeks didn't believe in the fusion of the tragic and the comic. But Johnson points out that this is the natural thing, because in life tragedy and comedy do not come in that way. They come hand in hand. We have laughter and tears together in life. So once again we repeat that what Shakespeare presented was a mirror of life. And this is, I told you, this you can get in page 136. And then point 7. So this you can get in page 138. The natural disposition of Shakespeare. So, well, almost a repetition of the earlier points. He's a natural man. He was a natural artist. And therefore, whatever he presented was natural. Well, even when the King Lear is there, well, we can find that the King Lear, in the first scene, well, you know, if you care to open the text and see how King Lear was so eager to entertain his would-be sons-in-laws. So one Indian critic, or Bengali critic rather, pointed out very interestingly that, well, Shakespeare seems to be a Bengali, because like the Bengali father-in-law, there we find King Lear so eager, so anxious to entertain his would-be sons-in-law. Now, well, this is the greatness of Shakespeare. Here in this part of India, we find Shakespeare, well, as if like ourselves. Well, in another part, they will find Shakespeare like themselves. So he was a natural man and his disposition was natural. And now I shall point out, well, what Dr. Johnson says about the defects of Shakespeare. Now, some of the demerits of Shakespeare, as pointed out by Dr. Samuel Johnson. Well, you can see over there I have written, Shakespeare sacrifices virtue to convenience. Well, what does Dr. Johnson mean by that? Does he mean that, well, Shakespeare doesn't follow poetic justice always? Actually, well, Shakespeare, the kind of man and the kind of artist that he was, as Johnson himself says, that natural man, well, so he knew, Shakespeare knew that this is a reality. Virtue is not always rewarded. And, well, therefore, Shakespeare went ahead in his own manner. At this point you can see in page 140. Second, loose plots. Well, his plots are not well neat. Well, I don't know why Dr. Johnson says, well, it may be that some of the plots are not well neat, but there are some great plays which definitely have compact plots. Anyway, Dr. Johnson specially mentions that the end part of many of his plays, the end parts of many of his plays are loosely constructed, and that you can see in page number 141. Dr. Johnson has objection about comic scenes of Shakespeare, and well, you know, he says the comic scenes, some of his comic scenes are very inefficient. And then he comes to the narrations, because, well, there are characters who go on speaking, well, for one, well, you know, speaking what they have to speak for quite a length of time, you know, well, maybe a very big paragraph, maybe, well, in printed page we find 2 pages, and continuously the character speaks, and Dr. Johnson says that this becomes tedious at times, and Shakespeare cannot perhaps remove this tediousness from the speeches, from some of the speeches which are very long. And therefore, well, these speeches become at one point very cold and often declamatory, high sounding. So these are some of the defects that Dr. Johnson speaks. Now, well, let me mention or refer to the pages once again. Inept comic scenes, etc. That is, well, page 141, and tedious narration, that is 142. Then I shall finally, well, how Dr. Johnson rounds off, I shall be showing you. Shakespeare speaks about Johnson's remark regarding the unities in Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare did not follow the unities of time and unities of time and place in his plays. According to Aristotelian dictum, a play was to be finished within 24 hours. In other words, the action of the play should not exceed 24 hours. To put it more easily, simply, what happens or what may happen in a span of 24 hours, only those incidents may be presented in a play. But in many of the plays of Shakespeare, we find he flouts this dictum, unity of time. And unity of place follows from the unity of time. So when there is a specific bar against or stipulation about time, when there is a specific stipulation about time, it will be natural that there will be a specific stipulation about place also. Because within a span of 24 hours, a man cannot move to great distances. So normally the play should be confined to one spot only. That was the dictum of Aristotle, or actually that was what was followed by the Greek masters. Shakespeare did not follow that. And Dr. Johnson here, now this point has been made in the text in page 143. Dr. Johnson here supports Shakespeare. He says that actually everything depends on the imagination of the spectator. Because we know that on the stage the man who is speaking to us is not King Lear. Maybe that he is the shopkeeper, but for the time being we accept him as King Lear. So if that we can accept, if that much of imagination we are ready to exercise, we can exercise more imagination also. So the same stage we can take for Egypt and Greece alternately. Because, well, it all depends on the imagination of man, on the mind of man. If man is ready to accept certain things, he or she will be ready to accept certain other things also. And then, he says that Shakespeare always used borrowed plots. Shakespeare was the least original in terms of story and plot, and that is mentioned in page 149. But, well, although his plots are borrowed, he could modify them, he could remold them, he could recreate them in such a way that in every case it became definitely a Shakespearean play. There is no play by William Shakespeare which does not have the specific signature of Shakespeare. Whether it is a borrowed plot or a borrowed story or not, that is not important. The important thing is that in its finished form, it becomes a Shakespearean play. And finally, in page 156 of this text, Dr. Johnson says, he owes nothing to us. Now what he means is that, well, we owe all to him. He reiterates his contention that Shakespeare, in spite of the defects that he has mentioned, is perhaps the greatest of all the playwrights in England. Another thing which I forgot to mention is that there is a difference between a play read and a play enacted. When you read a play, we can pause, we can think, and we can find out the technical lapses of a playwright. But when a play is enacted on the stage, we do not view them, we do not notice them at all. So when the plays of Shakespeare are enacted, well, we cannot find any kind of defect in them. But all these defects are deciphered, discovered, analyzed only when we read the plays. Basically, a play is not to be read, a play is to be enacted or staged. And Shakespeare's intention was to see his plays on the stage. He never thought of, well, his plays being prescribed in the syllabus of different universities. And well, all these points Dr. Samuel Johnson has mentioned in his text. I shall be taking them more elaborately in my next session. Thank you.